The evening in the small, peaceful home feels normal, almost too normal. The gentle hum of the television fills the living room, where the protagonist's disabled daughter sits comfortably in her wheelchair, her eyes fixed on the screen. The soft glow from the lamp casts a warm, comforting light over the room as the protagonist moves around the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. The air smells of home-cooked food, and for a moment there's nothing but the simple pleasure of a quiet evening together. The daughter occasionally glances at her parent, offering a soft smile, and they share light-hearted conversation, talking about the day, how school went, or a show they've been watching together. It's the kind of evening that's easy to take for granted, one where everything feels right. The world outside seems distant, as if nothing could ever disrupt this peaceful moment. But the camera lingers on the front door, slightly ajar in the background. Its creaking hinges are barely audible, but the quiet tension in the air hints at something more, something waiting just beyond the threshold. The peace of the room feels fragile, and the sense of unease grows with every passing second. Suddenly, the tranquility is shattered. A sharp, insistent knock on the door pierces the silence, loud and unsettling. The protagonist freezes for a moment, a knot tightening in their stomach. The daughter, startled, looks towards the door, sensing the change in atmosphere. The knock sounds again, louder this time, demanding attention. The once comfortable warmth of the home is now tinged with an undercurrent of tension, and as the protagonist moves toward the door, the sense of impending danger begins to settle in. The camera focuses on the door handle, and for a moment, everything feels suspended in time. Something is about to change, and whatever it is, it's not going to be good. The knock on the door was sharp and commanding, cutting through the quiet of the home like a sudden storm. The protagonist hesitated for a moment before opening the door, unsure of what to expect. Standing on the other side was Karen, dressed in a stiff, professional outfit, her smile forced and polite, but her eyes narrowed with a coldness that didn't quite match her greeting. "Good afternoon," she said, her tone syrupy sweet, but with an undertone of something else, something calculating. "I'm Karen with the Homeowners Association." She handed over a business card, her fingers barely touching the protagonist's as they took it. For a moment, the protagonist thought nothing of it. Karen's presence, though slightly off-putting, seemed harmless enough. However, the tension in her posture and the way she lingered in the doorway hinted that something wasn't quite right. The protagonist attempted to engage her politely, thinking it was another one of those routine HOA inspections, but Karen wasn't here for a friendly checkup. "I've come to speak with you about the situation with your daughter's wheelchair," Karen began, her voice smooth but now dripping with condescension. The words hung in the air, thick with judgment. "You see, while I'm sure you've got every right to have your daughter in your home, the wheelchair, it's becoming quite the eyesore, don't you think?" The comment landed like a slap. The protagonist stood frozen for a moment, taken aback by the blatant cruelty of the statement. Karen's eyes scanned the living room, lingering on the daughter's wheelchair as if it were an eyesore in the most literal sense. The warmth of the evening seemed to drain from the room, replaced by a cold, uncomfortable silence. The protagonist stammered for response, unsure of how to handle this unexpected attack. Karen continued, her words wrapped in false politeness. "I'm just trying to uphold the standards of this community. You understand, don't you? Aesthetics matter. The neighborhood values uniformity." Her voice was unwavering, as if this was a perfectly reasonable request. "The HOA rules state that every property should maintain a certain appearance. And, well, your daughter's wheelchair, while it may seem innocent enough to you, just doesn't fit that standard." The protagonist's stomach twisted. The words were meant to humiliate, to dehumanize. The daughter, still in her wheelchair, looked at Karen, confused and hurt, but Karen didn't even seem to notice, her gaze never wavering. The protagonist tried to respond, but Karen cut them off, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "If you don't comply and remove that eyesore from the front yard, there will be consequences." The threat hung in the air, heavy and menacing. She turned on her heel, walking away without another word, leaving the protagonist standing at the door, a chill creeping through their veins. As the sound of Karen's heels echoed down the walkway, the protagonist closed the door slowly, their hands trembling. The moment of false politeness had passed, and now the reality of what had just happened settled in. This was only the beginning. The storm had just started brewing. The front door had just clicked shut behind Karen, and the weight of her words hung heavily in the air. The protagonist stood motionless, staring at the door, their mind racing. The calm evening they'd shared just moments before now felt distant, replaced by an oppressive sense of unease. They couldn't shake the image of Karen's cold, calculating eyes, or the cruel way she had spoken about their daughter's wheelchair. It was as if she had intentionally torn through the fabric of their peaceful existence, and now there was a knot in their stomach that wouldn't loosen. The protagonist turned to their spouse, who was still sitting in the living room, their face drawn with worry. "What do we do now?" the protagonist asked, their voice shaking more than they intended. She made it sound like we don't have a choice. Their spouse sighed deeply, rubbing their temples as if trying to piece together the situation. "I don't know," they admitted, frustration mixing with worry. "We can either try to comply, but that would mean giving in, or we stand up to her, but she seems like the type who won't stop until she gets what she wants." The protagonist's thoughts spiraled. On one hand, Karen's threat was clear. If they didn't remove the wheelchair from the front yard, there would be consequences. On the other hand, giving in felt like a surrender. They had spent so long working to create a safe space for their daughter, a place where she could live without fear or judgment. The idea of allowing someone like Karen to dictate their life, to impose her idea of perfection on them, was unbearable. "What if she keeps coming back?" the protagonist muttered, almost to themselves. "What if she makes things worse for us? For her?" They motioned to their daughter, who had rolled herself into the room, her face full of innocent confusion. She had heard the argument, though she didn't fully understand it. She just knew that her mom and dad were upset, and that hurt her more than anything. Their spouse looked down at their daughter, and then back at the protagonist. "We need to protect her. We can't let Karen control our lives, but we also need to figure out what comes next." Just as the words left their spouse's lips, a sudden, sharp knock echoed through the room. The sound sent a shock of adrenaline through the protagonist's body, and they froze, heart pounding in their chest. Was it Karen again? Or someone else? The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. They stood there for a moment, unsure whether to answer, the tension building with every passing second. The calm before the storm was now over, and they were about to face whatever came next. The sharp knock on the door felt like a hammer pounding against the protagonist's chest. The sound echoed through the living room, setting nerves on edge. For a split second, everything seemed to stop. The protagonist's heart thudded heavily in their chest as they glanced toward their daughter, who was sitting quietly, looking confused and a little frightened. The knock had shaken her too, and she instinctively looked to her parent for reassurance. But reassurance was the furthest thing from the protagonist's mind. They had just finished talking about Karen's threat moments before, and now this sudden knock felt like the beginning of something far worse. What was Karen doing back here? What did she want? The protagonist's hand trembled as they reached for the door handle, every fiber of their being screaming at them not to open it. But they couldn't just ignore it. Taking a deep breath, they slowly turned the handle and cracked the door open, their eyes peeking through the narrow gap. And then, without warning, a loud, deafening bang shattered the silence. Time seemed to stretch, each moment lasting forever. The protagonist's eyes went wide, their body frozen in shock as the sound of the gunshot reverberated through the house. For a moment, they didn't know what had happened, just the rush of air from the force of the shot and the terrifying realization that someone had just fired a gun right through their front door. The metallic scent of gunpowder filled the air, sharp and sickening. The protagonist slammed the door shut instinctively, the weight of what had just occurred crashing down on them. They spun around to look at their daughter. The room was eerily still, except for the distant ringing in the protagonist's ears. In the chaos, they didn't even notice the blood starting to seep across the floor near the door. Their only thought was on their daughter. Had she been hit? Was she okay? The protagonist rushed toward her, heart pounding, eyes frantic. The daughter was still sitting in her wheelchair, shaking but unharmed, miraculously spared. The bullet had passed through the door, just inches from where she sat. The protagonist's breath caught in their throat as they reached her side, relief flooding through them, but it was short-lived. They couldn't let their guard down. Karen had just shot through their door, and they had no idea if she was still out there, waiting. "Stay low," the protagonist whispered urgently, crouching beside their daughter. Their voice was raw with panic, but they kept their tone as calm as they could. "We need to get to safety right now." The daughter's eyes were wide, filled with fear, but she nodded, gripping the armrests of her wheelchair. The protagonist stood, eyes darting to the door as they moved to grab their phone from the table. Hands shaking, they dialed 911, trying to control their breathing as they spoke into the phone. "Please, you have to help us. Someone just shot through our front door. My daughter, she's okay, but we need help. Now." They could hear the dispatcher on the other end, asking for more details, but all the protagonist could focus on was the sound of their own rapid heartbeat, the panic setting in like a heavy weight pressing against their chest. "Please," the protagonist repeated, glancing toward the door again, almost expecting Karen to appear at any moment, gun still in hand. "Hurry." The dispatcher assured them that help was on the way, but the protagonist wasn't sure if they could wait that long. The gunshot had shattered their sense of safety, and now every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside felt like a threat. They crouched beside their daughter, watching the door, waiting for any sign of movement, waiting for Karen to return. The air in the living room was thick with tension, every breath feeling too loud in the silence that followed the gunshot. The protagonist crouched beside their daughter, desperately trying to calm her, but the fear in her eyes mirrored their own. Her small hands trembled as she clutched the armrests of her wheelchair, her face pale with shock. The protagonist's heart raced, pounding in their chest as they fought to keep their composure. "Hey, look at me," the protagonist whispered, trying to sound steady. "You're okay. We're okay. Everything's going to be all right." But even as the words left their mouth, they didn't believe them. How could they? The door had been shot through. Someone had tried to hurt their family. They glanced at the shattered doorframe, now a jagged hole where the bullet had pierced through the wood, the remnants of glass scattered across the floor, reflecting the dim light from the living room. The hole in the door seemed to mock the protagonist, a stark reminder of the violence that had just invaded their home. It was as if Karen had crossed an invisible line, and there was no turning back from this. The protagonist could feel the adrenaline coursing through their veins, their hands shaking as they hovered over the phone, waiting for the emergency services to pick up. They had dialed 911, but the line seemed to stretch forever. Every second felt like an eternity. The sound of sirens in the distance was faint at first, but as time passed, they grew louder, drawing closer. "Stay down, sweetie. Stay low," the protagonist urged their daughter, who nodded silently, her face stricken with fear. She tried to adjust her position in the wheelchair, but the shock had her frozen, unable to move. The protagonist pulled a blanket over her, trying to shield her from the sight of the door and the chaos that had unfolded in their own home. Each passing second felt like an eternity. The protagonist's mind raced, replaying the moment over and over. Had Karen meant to kill them? Or was it just an empty threat that had spiraled out of control? The sound of the gunshot still echoed in the protagonist's mind, a deafening ring that drowned out everything else. Finally, they heard the screech of tires outside. The sirens were here. The protagonist didn't know whether to feel relief or fear. Help had arrived, but what would they find when they got inside? Would they believe what had happened? Would the authorities understand the danger they had just faced? The door opened with a soft creak as two officers rushed inside, their hands hovering near their weapons. The protagonist stood, heart pounding, feeling like they were being watched by every pair of eyes in the room. They opened their mouth to speak, but No words came out at first. Their voice felt trapped in their chest. Someone shot through our door, the protagonist finally managed to say, their voice hoarse. It was her, the woman from the HOA. She tried to kill us. The officers exchanged a quick glance, then moved toward the shattered door, carefully surveying the damage. The protagonist followed them, eyes glued to the scene. It was real. It wasn't a nightmare. This had actually happened. As the officers began their investigation, the sirens outside began to fade, replaced by the quiet hum of tension in the air. The protagonist stood motionless, unsure of what would come next, but knowing one thing for sure: Karen wasn't done yet. The flashing lights from the police cars outside bathed the room in a surreal, strobe-like rhythm. Inside, the tension was palpable. The protagonist sat at the edge of the couch, hands clenched tightly together, trying to steady their racing thoughts. Their daughter was still sitting quietly beside them, her face pale, eyes distant, as if she were still trapped in the chaos of what had just happened. The silence between them was suffocating, broken only by the low murmur of the police officers' voices as they examined the scene. Two officers entered the living room, their presence commanding attention. One was a tall, no-nonsense detective with sharp features, while the other, a younger officer, nervously adjusted his badge as he scanned the room. The older officer spoke first, his voice firm and steady. "Can you tell us what happened here?" he asked, his eyes meeting the protagonist's. The protagonist hesitated for a moment, the weight of the situation settling in their chest. They took a deep breath and recounted the events, their voice shaking as they spoke. Karen, the HOA representative, she came to the door earlier. She complained about my daughter's wheelchair, saying it was an eyesore, that it didn't fit with the neighborhood's standards. Then she threatened us, said there would be consequences if we didn't remove it. After she left, she came back and she shot through the door. The detective's eyes narrowed as he listened. He didn't interrupt, but there was a flicker of something behind his gaze, suspicion perhaps. He scribbled notes in his pad. Did you ever feel like she was going to do something like this? Was there any indication that she might escalate? He asked, his voice professional but probing. The protagonist nodded, their throat tight. She was cold. She kept insisting that my daughter's disability wasn't in line with the community's aesthetic. I didn't think she'd go this far, but something about her felt off. She was threatening. She made it clear that if we didn't comply, there would be consequences. The younger officer, who had been silently taking in the conversation, shifted uneasily on his feet. He had been to crime scenes before, but something about this case, something about the personal violation it represented, seemed to disturb him. He cleared his throat before speaking up. Did anyone else witness this? Did she say anything else when she was here? The protagonist shook their head, rubbing their temples. No, it was just me and my daughter. But she definitely implied something more, something bigger than just a complaint. I didn't think she'd come back, but when I opened the door, the detective interrupted, his voice soft but resolute. It's not your fault. You didn't ask for this. He glanced toward the younger officer, who quickly moved toward the door to examine the damage more closely. Just then, the sound of a phone buzzing broke through the momentary silence. The detective answered quickly, his expression tightening as he listened. Got it. We'll head over right now, he said, ending the call with a click. He turned to the protagonist. We've received a tip. Someone knows more about Karen's past actions. It seems she's been involved in other incidents. We need to follow this lead. The news sent a cold shiver down the protagonist's spine. There was more to Karen than they had initially thought. The sudden shift in the investigation felt like a turning point. The detective looked over his shoulder, as if already thinking ahead to the next steps. You stay here. Keep your doors locked and stay alert, he instructed. We'll keep you updated. The officers filed out, leaving the protagonist with a mix of dread and hope. The investigation was just beginning, and the weight of the truth was heavy in the air. What would they uncover about Karen? How far would this go? The suspense hung in the balance, leaving the protagonist to wonder if they would ever feel safe again. The protagonist sat at their desk, staring at the flickering screen of their laptop. The room was dimly lit, the shadows of the evening creeping in. Their mind was still reeling from the events of the day. The gunshot, the police investigation, the lingering fear that Karen wasn't done with them yet. They needed to know more. The thought of Karen's cold, calculated behavior gnawed at them. This wasn't just a one-time act of aggression. It felt like something deeper, something systematic. Determined to uncover the truth, the protagonist opened a new browser window and began searching for any trace of Karen's past. They typed in her full name along with the HOA's name, hoping for a lead. The screen flickered as results loaded, mostly from HOA meeting minutes and local neighborhood blogs. But then something caught their eye, an old forum post dated 2 years ago with a subject line that sent a chill down their spine. Karen's HOA reign of terror. Neighbors speak out. Clicking the link, the protagonist skimmed through the comments, each one more troubling than the last. Several former residents of the neighborhood had shared stories of Karen's behavior. How she had harassed the elderly, forced families to uproot their gardens, and targeted anyone who didn't conform to her vision of what the neighborhood should look like. The stories were eerily similar to what the protagonist had experienced. Karen wasn't just an enforcer of rules. She was a bully, using her power to intimidate, control, and tear down anyone who didn't fit her narrow view of perfection. The protagonist's heart raced as they dug deeper. They found emails from community meetings, one of which included Karen threatening to find a family with a disabled child, accusing them of being an eyesore to the neighborhood. The records painted a disturbing picture. Karen had a history of abusing her position to target vulnerable people, particularly those who couldn't fight back. It was a pattern of behavior, one that couldn't be ignored any longer. But there was more. Scrolling further, the protagonist uncovered a string of emails between Karen and several other HOA board members. At first glance, the emails seemed harmless, discussions about bylaws and neighborhood events, but as the protagonist dug deeper, they found something that made their blood run cold. One email mentioned an upcoming vote to change the neighborhood's accessibility guidelines, which would make it even harder for people with disabilities to access certain areas of their own homes. Another email hinted at a private meeting where Karen and some of the board members were discussing ways to clean up the neighborhood, implying that families with disabilities were unwanted. The hairs on the back of the protagonist's neck stood up as they pieced it together. This wasn't just a personal vendetta from Karen, it was part of a larger conspiracy within the HOA. A group of people, led by Karen, was using their power to push out anyone they deemed undesirable, anyone who didn't conform to their vision of the perfect neighborhood. The protagonist's stomach churned with the realization that this was far worse than they had ever imagined. As they stared at the screen, the pieces clicked into place, but with the new knowledge came new fear. This wasn't just about them anymore. Karen and her allies weren't going to stop. They had a whole system behind them. The protagonist leaned back in their chair, eyes wide with horror. This was bigger than they thought, and they were about to expose something that could shake the very foundation of the neighborhood. But there was one more piece to uncover, one final lead that could take this investigation to the next level. The protagonist felt a surge of determination. The truth was out there, and they were going to find it. The protagonist stood at the edge of Karen's front yard, the evidence they had uncovered weighing heavily in their pocket. The emails, the forum posts, the records from the HOA meetings, all of it was about to be used to confront the woman who had almost taken everything from them. With every step closer to the front door, the intensity of the moment built. The protagonist's heart pounded as they rehearsed the confrontation in their head. They had to be calm, calculated, and relentless. This wasn't just about their family anymore. It was about exposing Karen for what she really was. They reached the door and knocked once, firmly. It was now or never. After what felt like an eternity, Karen opened the door. Her smile was tight, almost mechanical, as she glanced at the protagonist. The smugness in her eyes didn't falter, even when she saw the folder the protagonist was holding. "What are you doing here?" Karen's voice dripped with annoyance, but her eyes flickered with the first signs of wariness. The protagonist stepped forward, their voice steady, but laced with anger. "We need to talk. You don't get to intimidate us any longer." Not after everything I've found. Karen's eyes narrowed, but she stepped aside, motioning for the protagonist to enter. If you're here to waste my time, don't bother, she sneered, crossing her arms as she closed the door behind them. The living room was quiet, cold in its sterility. It felt like walking into a space designed to intimidate with its sharp, minimalist decor. Karen stood, arms crossed, waiting for the protagonist to speak, but the silence between them stretched, thick, and palpable. I've seen the emails, the protagonist began, voice quiet but firm. I've seen what you've been doing with the HOA. How you've used your position to target families with disabilities, how you've harassed them, and tried to force them out. Karen's lips curled into a cold smile, as if she found this conversation amusing. And she asked, her tone mocking, "What's your point? People need to follow the rules, or they don't belong here. This neighborhood has a standard, and it's not my fault if some people don't fit in. The wheelchair, the mess, it's all a part of the problem." The protagonist's pulse quickened. They weren't going to back down. Not now. You don't get to decide who belongs. You don't get to harass people because they don't meet your vision of perfect. Karen's eyes hardened, her posture shifting. The calm facade she had worn now slipped, and the predator beneath it emerged. "You think you can stop me?" she hissed, stepping closer. "You think the police will do anything? I own this neighborhood. They'll back me, not you. And if you think this is over, think again. You've already made a mistake by coming here. The HOA has a lot of influence, and I'll make sure you regret this." The words hit like a punch to the gut. The protagonist could feel the pressure of the situation closing in on them, but they stood their ground. "It's not about influence, Karen. It's about justice. It's about holding you accountable for what you've done." Karen's smirk deepened, and she took a slow, deliberate step back. "You really don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice turning cold and sharp. "You think you're the first person to come at me like this? You're nothing. And after this, no one will ever believe you. I'll make sure of it." The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark and oppressive. The protagonist's hand clenched around the folder of evidence, and for a moment they felt an overwhelming urge to lash out, to make her see how much damage she had caused. But they fought to control themselves. This wasn't the time for anger. This was the time for truth. "You may think you're untouchable, but you're wrong," the protagonist said, voice steady but fierce. "I have everything I need to expose you for who you really are. You'll be held accountable." Karen's eyes flashed with a moment of real fury, and she took a step forward, her voice low and menacing. "You want to expose me? Fine. But don't think for a second that you'll come out of this unscathed. You're going to regret this. I'll make sure you pay." The protagonist stood tall, eyes locked onto Karen's, unflinching. The words hung in the air between them, thick with promise and threat. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. With one final look, the protagonist turned and walked out of the house, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on their shoulders. They knew this wasn't the end. Karen would retaliate. But now, the truth was on their side, and they were ready to face whatever came next. The sound of the phone ringing sliced through the tense stillness of the protagonist's home. The protagonist, who had been pacing anxiously, jumped at the noise and quickly grabbed the receiver, their breath tight with anticipation. The voice on the other end was the detective, the one who had been leading the investigation into Karen's actions. "We've got a warrant," the detective said, his voice low but urgent. "We're heading to Karen's house now. We've gathered enough evidence to search her property and make a case for harassment and illegal activity. You were right, she's been involved in more than just this incident." The protagonist's heart raced as the detective's words sank in. The authorities were finally taking action, building a case against Karen based on the evidence the protagonist had uncovered, emails, forum posts, and the unsettling pattern of harassment. Karen wasn't just a neighborhood bully, she was a criminal, and the walls around her were starting to crumble. "Thank God," the protagonist whispered almost to themselves as the reality of what was happening set in. "What's next? What do we do now?" "We'll be in touch once we have the results of the search," the detective said, his voice more focused now. "If things go as we expect, we'll be making an arrest today. But we need to move fast. Karen's not going to go down without a fight." Stay safe, and don't do anything reckless." The protagonist nodded, even though the detective couldn't see it. They hung up the phone, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on them. They had done everything they could, expose the truth, and now the authorities were in motion. But Karen had already shown how ruthless she could be. The protagonist knew this wouldn't be easy, and the danger wasn't over yet. As they moved to the window, peering out at the quiet street, a cold realization settled in. Karen wasn't going to let herself be arrested without a fight. The protagonist had seen her angry before, and it was clear now that she was capable of far worse than they had ever imagined. A surge of dread washed over them, but they fought to push it aside. This was bigger than just them. This was about holding someone accountable, about making sure no one else had to endure what they had. A knock on the door pulled the protagonist from their thoughts. They opened it to find a pair of officers standing on the other side, their faces serious but professional. "We need to speak with you," one of the officers said, his tone urgent but controlled. The protagonist stepped aside, allowing them into the house, their pulse quickening as they waited for the officers to explain. "We're preparing to make an arrest," the officer continued. "We've found evidence linking Karen to several other incidents, and we're confident we can charge her with multiple counts of harassment and attempted assault. But we need your continued cooperation. She won't go down quietly, and we expect things to get tense." The protagonist's throat tightened. The weight of the coming confrontation hit them hard. "What's the plan?" they asked, their voice barely more than a whisper. "We'll move in on her property soon. We need you to stay clear, but be ready for updates. If things go sideways, we'll call." The officers turned to leave, their eyes full of purpose. The protagonist watched them go, their mind racing with the uncertainty of what would come next. The authorities were ready to make their move, but the tension was unbearable. Would they catch Karen before she could escape, or worse, before she could retaliate? The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't going down without a final, explosive fight. The clock was ticking, and the hunt was about to begin. The sharp sound of sirens echoed in the quiet neighborhood, drawing closer and closer, each passing second ratcheting up the tension. The protagonist stood in the living room, eyes glued to the window as they waited. Every fiber of their being felt alive with anticipation and dread. It had been hours since the police had informed them about Karen's impending arrest, and now the moment was finally here. They could feel the weight of what was about to happen, the culmination of all the pain, the fear, and the injustice they had endured. Outside, the rumble of police cars grew louder. The protagonist's grip tightened on the edge of the couch, heart racing. Their daughter, sitting beside them, looked up with wide, uncertain eyes. She didn't fully understand what was going on, but the tension was palpable. She could sense that something had shifted, that this was a pivotal moment. The doorbell rang. It was quick, firm, almost too quick. The protagonist moved toward the door, their pulse pounding in their ears. They opened it slowly, but before they could speak, one of the officers stepped in. His face was stoic, but his eyes held a glimmer of satisfaction. "We've got her," he said, his voice grave, but with a note of finality. The protagonist exhaled, a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they allowed themselves to feel a small sliver of relief. The battle had shifted. Karen, the woman who had threatened their family, who had tried to tear them apart, was finally being held accountable. The officer continued. Karen resisted, of course, tried to claim she didn't know what we were talking about, even when we had the evidence. "But we have her. She's in custody." The protagonist's stomach churned as images of Karen's smug face flashed in their mind. The woman had made their lives a living nightmare, but now the law was finally catching up to her. Still, the relief felt hollow, like something was missing. The fear didn't leave entirely. It couldn't. A few moments later, the front door creaked open again, and this time, it wasn't the officer who stepped through, it was Karen. She was flanked by two officers, her hands cuffed behind her back, her expression twisted in a mix of fury and defiance. "Don't think this is over," Karen sneered as she was escorted past the protagonist, her eyes locked onto them. And for a moment, the protagonist could feel the full weight of her hatred. You think you won? This is just the beginning. You'll regret this. I'll make sure of it. The words hit like a slap in the face, and the protagonist's stomach dropped. Karen's voice was dripping with venom, and even in cuffs, she still exuded an air of power. But this time, the protagonist didn't flinch. They held their ground, unwavering. "We're not afraid of you anymore," the protagonist said, their voice steady, though a part of them trembled. As Karen was led out the door and toward the waiting police cars, her eyes never left the protagonist. She snarled one last time, muttering, "This isn't over." The police officers ushered her into the car, the door slamming shut behind her with a finality that echoed in the protagonist's mind. The car pulled away, the flashing lights disappearing into the distance. The protagonist turned to their daughter, who was still watching the scene unfold with a mix of confusion and curiosity. They bent down and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "It's over, sweetie," they said softly, their voice tinged with exhaustion and relief. "We did it. She won't hurt us anymore." But as the car disappeared around the corner, the protagonist couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of their stomach. Karen's promise that this wasn't the end lingered in the air like a dark cloud. The battle was won, but the war wasn't over. Not yet. The protagonist sat in the small, sterile office of their lawyer, the weight of the coming trial pressing down on their shoulders. The walls, lined with law books and framed legal diplomas, felt distant and cold, a stark contrast to the fiery emotions swirling inside. Their hands rested on the table, trembling ever so slightly, betraying the calm mask they were trying to maintain. The lawyer, a seasoned professional with a calm demeanor, paced slowly across the room, preparing the final details for the trial. He paused for a moment, looking at the family, father, mother, and daughter, before speaking with measured confidence. "We're ready for this, but it's going to be a fight. Karen's defense is going to be aggressive. She's already set the stage to claim it was self-defense, that she felt threatened by your daughter's wheelchair and her presence in the neighborhood. She'll argue that the shooting was an unfortunate misunderstanding, a result of escalating tension over the community's so-called standards." The protagonist's stomach tightened at the thought of Karen's twisted version of events. They knew the truth. Karen had deliberately shot through their door after threatening them, but the courtroom was a different battlefield. The prosecutor had done their part to compile evidence, but Karen's lawyer, well-connected and ruthless, was bound to try to turn the narrative around. "It won't be easy," the lawyer continued, "but the evidence we have, her history of harassment, the threats she made, the investigation, and the testimonies, we'll make sure the truth comes out." Despite the reassurance, the protagonist's anxiety continued to build. The truth was on their side, but the weight of the unknown hung heavy. They glanced at their daughter, who was sitting quietly beside them, clutching her stuffed animal in her lap. The little girl, still too young to fully understand the intricacies of what was going on, had endured so much already. The fear of losing her, of allowing Karen to win, was a constant ache in the protagonist's chest. They took a deep breath and nodded. "We have to win this. For her." The lawyer's face softened for a moment. "You're not alone in this. The whole community is watching. You've already shown them the strength of your family." The clock on the wall ticked steadily forward, the hours slipping away, each one marking the growing inevitability of the trial. The tension between the sides was palpable. Karen's attorney had already requested multiple delays, trying to buy time, hoping for any crack in the case. The trial was set to start soon, and the protagonist knew they needed to be prepared for the emotional toll. The days leading up to the trial were filled with sleepless nights and preparation. The lawyer ran mock cross-examinations, testing the family's composure and getting them accustomed to the pressure they would face under the bright lights of the courtroom. Each session felt like an emotional gauntlet, forcing the protagonist to relive the trauma, to face the anger and fear they had fought to suppress. The date of the trial loomed large, and as the jury was selected, the protagonist's heart raced. They could hear the hum of activity in the courthouse, the murmurs of those gathered for other cases, but it felt like the world had narrowed down to the courtroom. Everything was riding on this moment. Their eyes met with the eyes of Karen's lawyer as he glared across the room, his expression confident. But the air between them crackled with the tension of what was about to unfold. The battle for justice was about to begin in earnest, and though the protagonist had no idea how long it would take or how much they would have to endure, they knew one thing for certain. They couldn't back down now. They had come too far to lose. The courtroom was a silent storm of tension. The hard, cold seats felt like weights pressing down on the protagonist's chest, but they held their head high as they took the stand. Their heart raced in their chest, and the air around them felt thick, like a fog that clouded their thoughts. Karen's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man with a calculating look, sat across the room, preparing for the battle ahead. His steely gaze met the protagonist's for a brief, silent moment. No words were exchanged, but there was an unmistakable hostility in the air, like a silent war of wills. The prosecutor stood, moving confidently to the front of the room. The case against Karen had built over days of meticulous investigation, and the time had come to present it all. The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense attitude, called upon the evidence. She outlined Karen's history of harassment, referencing the numerous complaints against her, including the threats she made and the manipulative tactics she employed to force people out of the neighborhood. The emails, the forum posts, the records from HOA meetings, everything painted a picture of a woman willing to go to extreme lengths to impose her vision of perfection on the community. But none of that could compare to the damning evidence that had finally brought her to court, the shooting through the front door. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecutor began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. The evidence here is not just about one act of violence. It is about a pattern, a repeated attempt to control, intimidate, and violate the rights of the innocent. This is not just a case of someone lashing out in frustration. This is a calculated act of aggression committed by a woman who had no regard for the safety or well-being of others. We ask you today to consider the full weight of her actions and to bring justice to this victimized family. The prosecutor's words hung in the air like a heavy curtain, and the jury's eyes were locked onto her, following her every movement. She turned to the protagonist, who stood, nervous but resolute, ready to share their side of the story. The prosecutor gently nodded in their direction. "Please, tell the court what happened that night." With a deep breath, the protagonist took the stand, recounting the events of that fateful evening. Their voice shook at times, but they kept going, describing how Karen had first knocked on their door, complaining about their daughter's wheelchair. They spoke about the threats Karen made, how she had said there would be consequences. The protagonist described the tension that had built inside their home after Karen's visit, how they tried to calm their daughter and prepare for whatever might come next. Then, when they heard that knock again, louder this time, more insistent, their entire world had shattered. The gunshot that rang out from the other side of the door still echoed in their mind. The protagonist told the jury how they had rushed to protect their daughter, how they feared the worst, and how they had called for help. Every detail was painful to relive, but the protagonist pushed through it, determined to ensure that Karen's actions would not be forgotten. When they finished, the room was silent. The weight of the testimony seemed to hang in the air, palpable and heavy. The prosecutor moved forward, making one last emotional appeal. This family did nothing to deserve this. They were simply trying to live their lives, to give their daughter a safe and happy home. But one woman, driven by power and prejudice, nearly took that all away. Her voice cracked slightly, but she held it together. "I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to stand with them, to give them the justice they deserve." The defense lawyer, calm and collected, stood next. He was not the type to rely on emotional appeals. His strategy was simple: to discredit the protagonist's testimony and cast doubt on the events as they had been presented. He walked slowly in front of the jury, his hands folded behind his back. "The truth, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and cold, "is that this was an unfortunate accident. Yes, Karen fired a shot through that door, but it wasn't an act of malice. It was a defensive measure. She was simply scared. This family was making her feel threatened. My client was responding to what she perceived as an immediate danger. The defense lawyer's eyes flicked over to Karen, who sat in the back, her eyes narrowed, her expression tight. We are all aware of the unfortunate things that can happen when people allow their emotions to guide their actions. But this is not the story of a woman trying to harm others. This is the story of a woman defending herself from an escalating situation. The jury listened carefully, but the doubt he tried to plant in their minds was a fragile thing. The facts were on the side of the prosecution. The evidence spoke for itself. As the defense finished, the courtroom fell into a tense, waiting silence. The jury was ready to deliberate, and the fate of Karen now hung in the balance. The prosecutor's final words echoed in the protagonist's mind. Justice is not just about proving innocence or guilt. It's about ensuring that the truth is heard and that the ones who suffer are given a chance to heal. The courtroom doors closed behind the jury as they went to deliberate, and the protagonists sat back in their chair, staring ahead. They didn't know how long the deliberations would take, but the waiting felt unbearable. The trial had become more than just a case. It had become a fight for their family, for their daughter, and for the justice that had been denied to them for far too long. Would the jury return with a verdict in their favor, or would Karen's manipulation and power continue to win? The answer was in their hands now. The courtroom doors swung open with a soft creak, and the jury filed in, their faces unreadable. The tension in the room was suffocating, the silence unbearable. The protagonists sat at the edge of their seat, heart pounding in their chest. Their hand instinctively found their daughter's, gripping it tightly, as if holding onto something solid in the midst of this whirlwind. The defense lawyer sat stoically, his eyes focused ahead, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in the way he adjusted his tie. The judge looked down at the jury as they settled into their seats, the moment stretching out longer than it should have. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The judge asked, his voice firm and authoritative. The foreman of the jury stood, paper in hand, his voice clear, but with a hint of solemnity. "We have, Your Honor. We find the defendant, Karen last name, guilty of reckless endangerment and aggravated assault with a firearm." The words hit like a wave crashing over the protagonist. Guilty. Karen was finally being held accountable for what she had done. The weight of the words seemed to echo throughout the courtroom. For a brief moment, everything went still. The protagonist's breath caught in their throat, and they could hear the sound of their own heartbeat in their ears. They squeezed their daughter's hand again, a silent prayer of relief passing through them. Karen's expression faltered for the first time. Her face, which had once been full of defiance, now looked pale and strained. She stood, her arms still shackled, but there was no triumph in her eyes anymore, only the bitter sting of defeat. Her lawyer stood beside her, his expression cold, his lips pressed into a thin line. The judge nodded, then addressed Karen directly. "Karen, last name, the court finds you guilty of the charges against you. Given the severity of your actions and the emotional trauma inflicted upon the victims, you are hereby sentenced to X years in prison." The words landed with a finality that seemed to reverberate in the air. Karen's face contorted into a sneer, but there was no escaping the reality now. She had lost. The power she had once wielded so ruthlessly over the neighborhood had crumbled under the weight of justice. The protagonist stood as the sentencing was read, their knees slightly weak, but steady. They looked at their daughter, whose wide eyes were filled with a mixture of confusion and relief. The journey had been long, the pain deep, but they had made it through. The emotional scars would take time to heal, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the protagonist allowed themselves to breathe, to feel the weight lifting off their shoulders. As Karen was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the protagonist watched her go, but there was no sense of triumph in their eyes. There was no joy in seeing Karen taken away, only a quiet satisfaction, a knowing that justice had been served. The family walked out of the courthouse together, the weight of the ordeal still heavy, but lighter than it had been before. The sun was setting as they stepped into the parking lot, casting a warm glow over the day. They had won, but they had also lost something in the process, innocence perhaps, or the belief that the world was fair. The protagonist held their daughter close, a tender moment of quiet reflection passing between them. Justice had been served, but the journey to this point had forever changed them. As they drove away from the courthouse, the screen faded to black, and the quiet hum of the car engine filled the silence. The story was over, but the impact of standing up for what was right, no matter the cost, lingered in the air, as undeniable as the love and resilience that carried them through. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update from HOA Karen Shorts. Join us as we dive deeper into the most shocking and dramatic HOA stories, revealing the truth behind the conflicts that go unnoticed. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. Keep watching HOA Karen Shorts for more powerful stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.